Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily French Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
I'm okay, Nicholas. How are you?
I'm okay, as well as one can be on a Monday. And I'm also joined today by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm slightly more than okay, but so I hope by the end of the show we're all feeling a little bit cheerier and
well, that's usual for Cape Townians to be in a better mood than Joe Burgers these
days.
There
we go. Yeah.
So you're just doing your part. Okay, let us get into the news. And the first piece of news, of course, is that over the weekend we got the news that Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the leader of the IFP, has died at the age of 95. He died early on Saturday morning. He had been ill for a while, so this is not completely unexpected. President Cyril Ramaphosa put out a statement on his death. I'm quoting the president here when I say, quote, "I am deeply saddened to announce the passing of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the Prince of, I'm going to pronounce that, traditional Prime Minister to the Zulu monarch and nation, and founder and President Emeritus of Inkatha Freedom Party. Prince Buthelezi has been an outstanding leader in the political and cultural life of our nation, including the ebbs and flow of our liberation struggle, the transition which secured our freedom in 1994, and our democratic dispensation. The ANC's KZN provincial chairperson has asked for a state funeral for Buthelezi, although it's not clear yet whether I think that's going to happen or not. But Buthelezi was one of these really important figures in South Africa's history. Of course, the IFP was a very key organization, particularly leading up through the 90s. But all the way back, and I believe it was founded in 1976, I think I'm correct in saying, or at least the 1970s. 75. No, 75, thank you. Buthelezi was key in resisting the designs of grand apartheid by very aggressively opposing independence for the KwaZulu homeland, which he was the head of. But he also has many detractors who criticize him for his role in violence during the 90s in South Africa. If you look at the foreign press in particular, there's this very negative portrayal of Buthelezi as a murderer, as a Zulu nationalist, as a stooge of apartheid. But as our own Anthea Jeffrey has written in an obituary that I will put in the description of today, there was also a lot of tarring of his name by the ANC, who often made him out to be this kind of puppet of apartheid, when the ANC strategy of People's War had a lot to do with the murder and violence that ran through the 90s. But I think it's fair to say that he has at least a little bit of a controversial legacy. He, of course, led the IFP for many years until actually quite recently, after democracy happened, going from one of the most important political parties in the country to a more regional party. But it seems to be going through a bit of a resurgence, which we may see in the next election. So, Michael, let me start off with you. What do you make of Buthelezi's life? I mean, I've only just scratched the surface here. Among the many, many things he did in his life, he played King Cetshwayo in the film Zulu, in the 1960s film Zulu, along with Michael Caine and all those great British actors. Really interesting guy. What do you make of his legacy?
I think one thing we have to promise ourselves is to leave to Terence to talk about the film, because in case listeners and viewers don't know this, Terence is a real cognoscente when it comes to films, and you have very interesting things to say about it, and also great insight into military history. So I think that we'll reserve that for that. I think you're quite right. A very complex figure. But a very important one as well. And there are two things that I just sort of briefly like to highlight on that aspect. Is the one is Anthea's stating right at the start that in steadfastly rejecting a spurious independence for the KwaZulu homeland, Buthelezi played this key role in compelling the National Party to keep looking for alternatives and in the end to embark on negotiations for a new South Africa. I think that's a very significant thing. And then allied to that is a point that Linda van Tilburg makes in what I think is a very good, also a very good obituary in Business Day, and she here in fact quotes a veteran Afrikaans language journalist and editor of umpteen newspapers. He also, in fact, with me and many others in the late 80s and 90s, covered that political period. He was a fellow political correspondent in Parliament, Tim du Plessis, who makes this point that Buthelezi seldom gets credit for the fact that, quote, he insisted that no negotiations on South Africa's political future could take place without the unbanning of the ANC, his arch opponent at that time, and the unconditional release from prison of Nelson Mandela. So I think if you take those two things, that immediately muddles the picture sufficiently to this extent that one must be suspicious of a view that rejects Buthelezi as the man covered in blood, this ghoulish figure who is completely bad. And it raises all the kind of points about the political contention that began to happen towards the end of the 80s into the 90s. A huge amount at stake. He was the leader of an organization that he founded, in fact, in 1975, and it was really it was established then as a cultural organization. I think its full name was the National Cultural Liberation Movement, Inkatha National Cultural Liberation Movement, and it was only in '94 actually that the name was changed to Inkatha Freedom Party and became a sort of formal political organization. But this also gives a hint to its regional. It's a kind of regional quality and almost a tribal quality. I think also cultural aspects, which I think always make politics very difficult. And this was certainly so, I think, in KZN in the late 80s and the 90s. And the thing that I was thinking about this morning, is could anyone at that time, certainly if I think of myself, could we have said these are the good guys and these are the bad guys? Looking at the ANC, looking at the IFP, looking at the National Party. And I think it was very difficult then, if you were genuinely attempting to try and understand all the forces that were coming to bear on a process. Very difficult to say, definitely, yes, this is a completely good guy, this is a completely bad guy. It was also in the spirit of the time, obviously, that people were willing to overlook the weaknesses and try and engage. But whatever the minutiae and whatever these complex contradictions and might be, the fact remains, I think, that Buthelezi emerged as a very significant figure. Some people will be skeptical about the extent to which he pushed negotiations to the very edge before agreeing to come in and participate. But he was, a significant figure, and he did stick to a very principled position on sanctions, on non-violence publicly. His detractors will say that he secretly allowed it or condoned it, which he's disputed. But nevertheless, I think a significant figure in the emergence of the democratic transition.
Terence, there's so many things to say about Buthelezi. I mean, his influence was incredible on many aspects. I mean, I believe that he played a key role in the ascension of the current Zulu monarch, at least according to some of the reporting I've read. So he continued to be a key figure, and I've always heard from some people in my family that they thought that sort of Inkatha got a bit of a raw deal in the 90s, in the sense that there were definitely things you could criticize about Inkatha during that violent period. I worked with a woman in the DA who still had machete scars on her from when IFP people came into her shack and slashed her with a machete. But there was this particular feature that of how the foreign press never really seemed to take the IFP's side of the story ever. Not all of them, but generally speaking, that was the case. And I think that is reflected a bit in the fact that you see that the foreign obituaries of Buthelezi are much harsher than the South African obituaries, where people from both left and right are more willing to explore the sort of complexities of his life, whereas the sort of foreign press is more damning. Terence, what do you make of all this?
Look, I think that's something that is often overlooked when reflecting on the 1980s, and certainly I don't think was taken properly into account by many observers at the time, was that South Africa was actually a real country with complex political problems and not a morality play in which there were good guys and bad guys. For a lot of casual observers of South Africa abroad, it was a wonderfully simple dichotomy. Now, the ANC understood that they were no slouches when it came to political strategy, and they were determined that when change happened, they were going to be in the driver's seat. They didn't want much competition, certainly not any serious competition, and for that reason, they took a particularly harsh line on groups within, let's say, black parties that pose some sort of credible challenge. Not only in Carter, but the Black Consciousness movement is often forgotten. That was a very powerful force in South Africa for a long time. I wonder how many South African school children who are even aware of who he was would know that Steve Biko was not a member of the ANC. Now, what Buthelezi, I think, played a complicated game, part collaboration, part confrontation. But Anthea is quite correct that if only, and Buthelezi made this point on several occasions, if every other homeland took independence and denationalized their populations, South Africa would still be stuck with a majority African population because of the simple numerical calculus of those that were classified as Zulus. So that essentially made grand apartheid unworkable. I think that there is a great deal to be said about, or a great deal to be argued over, over the choices he made in those years, and there certainly is a lot to discuss. But my overall assessment is that in a country with few angels and few devils, and I would say fewer angels than devils, he went to his grave, having played an honourable part, certainly not an entirely uncontentious part in South Africa's history, but also I think a part that is not fully understood, and I think this is where both foreign and local observers often came short. That the IFP had a particular set of objectives that were often very difficult for outsiders to understand. The question of traditional leadership, for instance, that was something that even people who could be very sympathetic to the IFP's overall narrative, free markets and being anti-sanctions, found very difficult to unpack. And things like the Ingonyama Trust, I would say that cost a pall over post-apartheid South Africa. But let's also remember that the ANC could talk a good game about taking traditional leaders out of politics until it found itself with the means to exercise control. After which, it could jump very much into the role that it had accused the IFP of holding. And I think that for many observers it was simply something that for perhaps cultural, linguistic, whatever reasons, it just remained almost impenetrable in order to assess its own behavior. And back in the 80s, the 90s, and now, I think one has to sort of spend some time unpacking what were its objectives and how effective was it in protecting those.
That's a very good thoughts, I think. Michael, any final closing remarks from you? I often think about the sort of IFP's role in post-democracy South Africa, where we had, the IFP. I mean, another little strange fact about Buthelezi's, very impactful life is that I believe he was the acting president when we invaded Lesotho in the 90s.
Yes, he was.
Because Mbeki and what's it called? Nelson Mandela were out of the country at the time.
Indeed.
But the IFP did struggle, particularly afterwards. They tried a bunch of things. They were, dominant in KZN. They won 51% of the vote initially there, and they ruled the province. But they never really managed to kind of lever that into a national thing. They went into a coalition with the DP I think it was the DA or the DP, I can't remember, back in 2004. Somewhere around there, 2006, 2004, the Coalition for Change, which didn't really work. They really took a hammering during the Zuma years, and they sort of disappeared almost, except for in a couple of those very rural KZN municipalities. And now they seem to be having a bit of a resurgence across KZN. Your final thoughts?
I mean, very interesting. And I think no mean feat in a way for a party to seem to almost disappear into the background and then be able to resuscitate itself and restore some kind of visibility and significance, which clearly is happening. So they've managed to hold it together, and it might well be those kind of cultural tribal things that are quite a strong binding agent. There were just two things that I wanted to, well, actually three that I wanted to mention. One is that I'd forgotten until a colleague reminded us this morning in a chat that Buthelezi's political life began actually as a member of the ANC Youth League. I think he joined in 1949, so a year after, probably less than a year after apartheid was inaugurated. There he was, taking a stand. And then latterly sort of fell out and so on. So 1975 was founding of the Inkatha movement, or
originally supported by the ANC, I believe, when it was founded.
That's right. I think there was a great deal of common ground, and allied to that then is the other point that I wanted to raise, which is a document that Anthea mentions. Apparently a confidential ANC document reported to have been drawn up in February 1992. And this identifies Buthelezi's power base as significant and a great threat, and that everything must be done. He must be brought under unbearable pressures. Are some of the words in this document. I'd love to know more about this document. It sounds very interesting, but it would certainly make sense that the ANC beginning now to plot and plan its this kind of end game of the struggle, suddenly perceiving this great risk in the Inkatha Freedom Party. And then just the final thing, I do want Terence just to comment very briefly on the film that we mentioned. That's something we've overlooked.
Well, look, I think it's important to remember that human beings are three-dimensional. And I think one thing about Buthelezi, that even the Mail and Guardian paid him a tribute at the time, while prefacing the editorial that we've had severe differences. He was a very lonely voice in the cabinet that actually spoke about AIDS. He lost, I think, one, possibly two children.
That's right.
And he was very, very forthright, while there was a lot of tippy-toeing around what was, whether this was a problem or not. So I think that is something to be remembered. He was also a very devout Anglican, which was interesting because the Anglican Church in South Africa, in its ecclesiastical hierarchy, tended very strongly towards the ANC, and certainly towards the ANC positions. Yeah. And he was also apparently a very faithful family man. In fact, I know somebody whose politics I would describe as actually kind of woke left, who voted IFP on the basis of the respect he showed for his wife after her death. But on the movie, he played Kitchwayo, and actually I think physically carried the role off very, very well. And I think there was certainly a sort of regal bearing. And although I think that Zulu, as opposed to Zulu Dawn, the later one about Asantlowana, tended to be more a kind of boy's own hero story, full of a lot of wisecracks and creature of its time, enjoyable movie. I thought that Buthelezi brought a certain degree of gravitas to it. Now, an unknown, not widely known detail is that he was not allowed to watch that movie because it was banned, I think, for all people under 12 and all Bantu. Apparently, a special showing was arranged for him, and he came in and he watched it, and there was sort of, Zulus being gunned down. It was very much from the British point of view. Stood up, looked at them, said interesting, and walked out.
Amazing, fascinating.
Fascinating stuff. Very good of you to bring up that point about HIV, because we remember, I think we've already beginning to forget from our collective consciousness how the ANC, particularly Thabo Mbeki, just so bungled that.
But it's often forgotten. Nelson Mandela had very little to say about it either. He didn't bring denialism to the Mbeki level, but he certainly, I think that there was a certain traditionalist reticence to talk about sexual matters. And these are all things that make us human.
Yeah,
indeed. Anyway, very interesting man, interesting life, and a lot of impact on South Africa. Let's move on to coalition nonsense that's going on across our metros. And we've seen a lot of articles recently about the EFF and ANC's relationship, as they are currently in coalition in a number of municipalities around the country. And apparently it's falling apart. At least that's what these articles have been saying. And we saw the latest one this weekend in City Press, where apparently the ANC's national leadership in particular is fed up with the alliance with the EFF. I think it's hurting the party. And they are now considering options that I think previously might have been thought of as unthinkable. The first is that apparently they're thinking of offering the DA a deal where they will run some municipalities in some of the metros in exchange for the DA getting control of others. So I think they were going to leave the DA in Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay, and in return they would govern Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni. I think that's probably a non-starter for the DA, particularly because they've just made this huge song and dance about the multi-party charter and not supporting the ANC, and that would destroy that completely. So I reckon that's probably not going to happen. But the more interesting suggestion of the ANC's is that they might be open to supporting the DA's motion to dissolve the Joburg Council. Now, I made a mistake in the previous episode where we talked about this. The DA has proposed that the Joburg Council, because it's so dysfunctional, should be dissolved and new municipal elections held within 90 days. I thought that it required a simple majority of council, but it actually requires 2/3. The ANC is considering supporting this motion because they think that they might be able to get something, a better deal out of a fresh election in the municipality. Even if the DA and ANC vote together in the Joburg Council, though, they still won't have 2/3. They will need 17 councillors more to support them. So that might come from Action SA, although Action SA suggested that they might not support this motion. But what's interesting, though, is the ANC will only likely agree to dissolving the council if they can hold the election on the same day as the national and provincial elections, presumably when the ANC will have an advantage, because the ANC tends to do much worse in municipal elections than in provincial or national. So they're hoping that maybe they can rescue themselves in the municipality a bit for that. And who knows if the DA will agree to that? They might not, because they might think, what's the point of dissolving the council if we just get the ANC either maintaining or growing its vote share? But I think what this all does suggest, firstly, is that the EFF and ANC coalition is not as stable as I think many people predicted originally. And secondly, that things are becoming more interesting in our politics. Parties are beginning to consider options they never have before. I remember a time, actually, when I was interning partly under Terence in the Gauteng legislature and in the research office there. And at that time, the DA proposed emergency house building kits for people in the province, and the ANC voted it down simply because, not because they disagreed with the proposal, but because it came from the DA. And it looks like that era may be fading away a bit. I don't know. Terence, what do you make of this?
Yeah, desperation maketh strange bedfellows. I think, though, I think that they've discovered something about the EFF, that the EFF might not be a bigger dog, but it's got aspirations to be a bigger dog, and it's a much more voraciously hungry and vicious dog. And where they have had working relationships in the past, it's been either with parties with which it could do business, IFP to some extent. I think a lot of that was cultural. It was pointed out at one point that when they were resolving the civil war in KZN, and it was notable that the delegations tended to consist only of, let's say, indigenous Africans. The whites and Indians in both parties tended not to be involved there. And I think there was some truth to that these were the people who were actually seeing weren't seeing this as an ideological thing, but seeing, their friends and families die. But, also personal connections. I think Malema, in a way, is just beyond that. Very goal focused, knows what he wants, and sort of knows how to get it. And I think that they are starting to stress there, and maybe they're gambling that they would be able to either buy the DA off in some way through control of municipalities. Perhaps that they would be able to draw it in and control it because they would control the civil service. Will this happen? I doubt it. I think, in a way, for better or worse, the DA has put herself in a bit of a corner by making such an issue of the Patriotic Alliance being in, having made deals. And also, I think that their relationship with Action SA, which in ideological terms is easily the most closely aligned party that they have, even in terms of party background, is complicated by enormous I think personal hostilities. One of which I think hinges around this question of ANC versus EFF. You can't work with the EFF even on local level, says the DA. And to which Chairman Mashab will say, "Well, I won't work with the ANC under any conditions, and look what you guys are doing." I don't know. Maybe the ANC also reckons this is sort of triangular diplomacy, and they're going to take down the moonshot before it even gets off the launching pad.
Yeah, no, it is a little bit frustrating that we endlessly see these stories about the ANC proposing things to the DA, but no comment ever from DA people about how they feel about these things, which annoys me somewhat. But Michael, what do you make of all this?
It's all very interesting. The complex Johannesburg politics is a little bit beyond me. But yeah, the permutations of all the things that Terence has been describing are quite fascinating and quite worrying in a way. But I also wonder, and I hope it's not simply out of a kind of inborn naivety, that I half sense that perhaps parties are beginning, especially the ANC, facing an election next year, probably its most important one. Perhaps is there the sense that's growing that, to speak for the people's interests is no longer enough just to be rhetorical. People are now actually looking at things like buildings burning down and 76 people dying and things just not being fixed and load shedding just going on day after day. And is there this sense creeping in finally that we've actually got to get serious, and that if this deal with the EFF is, all it's doing is it's just perpetuating a sort of constant crisis. Nothing is being done on the streets. We're having to focus all our attention on just holding the thing together. It's just not working. Perhaps this is a good thing. Well, it would be a good thing. But do you think? I don't know if that's a feasible interpretation. That some kind of reality is beginning to set in here.
That's very possible. I do also think that what this suggests is that, contrary to sort of the lazy view of South Africa, that the EFF speaks for some kind of, true populist message. The ANC is clearly not that comfortable and thinks that the EFF is hurting them by being in government with them. And it's interesting that, and maybe this is all just an election ploy to make overtures towards the DA. But there has been some research from our former boss, Frans Cronje's outfit, the Social Research Foundation, which has suggested that most South African voters are actually very strongly in favor of an ANC-DA coalition. or I'm not sure if it's most, but it's a very large chunk. And maybe this ANC is simply trying to win over those people and say, look, we're trying. Look, we'll get the DA in to fix the governance, but we'll stay in charge or something like that. I don't know what to make of all this, but I will point everyone rather self-indulgently to my own article I wrote about EFF-ANC coalitions back in November of last year, where I suggested that they're really not that, they're actually not that good together, despite their ideological similarities. They just compete on too many levels. But we'll have to see, because the coalition hasn't broken down yet, despite all these articles saying that it's on the verge of collapse for weeks now.
Let me just put something in there that I think that this signals that the assured one-party dominance is over.
Yes.
This is not something that would be remotely conceivable under Mandela. Tony Leon could be invited into the cabinet provided he accepted that he's got to sit down and behave like a good boy. And Mbeki, he wouldn't even meet Tony Leon. They had no relationship. Under Zuma, it was this sort of Brezhnevite, things just kind of carry on because we're the ANC and we're okay. And maybe something that Ramaphosa's tenure has brought in is that this thing is really broken now, and we've got to start thinking of some other way to at least keep some of the kitty. But here's the other thing. I think for the it also puts the DA in a bit of a position. The DA and people from the DA will tell you they don't have broomstick support. They couldn't just put up a broomstick and get people to vote for it. There goes the power. So I do think that there is a certain constituency who would be quite offended by this, that the DA has there's the possibility the DA could be stepping in and saving our bacon, keeping Joburg running or something, but they're turning it down. They are, and the DA itself has made quite a big issue of this, how their real opponent long term is the EFF. Well, what isn't this the chance to start bringing the ANC over onto our side? I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. But then again, I lived through an era which saw Buthelezi transition from something more evil than P.W. Botha to a co-liberator of the country. So.
Yes, ANC seems to very aggressively be angling, I think, for IFP support from that one, which is yet another sign, as you say, Terence, that the one-party dominance is coming to an end. But anyway, very interesting stuff, but we'll have to see how things shake out. And I think that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Wrap. Cheers, everyone.